A true-to-life horror story in an Arizona prison. A cell with no lights, 24 hours of darkness would be the theater of the worst murder in the history of the Arizona Department of Corrections, where an inmate who begged officers to get out of the cell as they walked by and laughed would be found the next day beheaded and castrated. Let's get into it. Jasper Rushing grew up in Arizona amid family instability and deep resentment toward men who preyed on women and children. That hatred would define his life and eventually his crimes. He lived by that code. Eventually, he would hear rumors about his stepfather, Rudy Gutierrez, that he had raped his little sister Amy years ago. Grabbing his shotgun, he snuck into the trailer where his stepdad was sleeping with another woman. As he came inside the trailer, the woman awoke. He said, "I'm not here to hurt you," he told her. He raped Amy 5 years ago. Before his stepdad could even realize what was going on, at point-blank range, he pulled the trigger and blew his head off. Just moments later, Rushing called 911 himself and surrendered calmly to deputies. Even though his sister denied it, he felt she was doing it out of fear, that she felt guilty for getting her father killed, even though it wasn't her fault. It was a self-appointed act of vengeance, not justice, depending on how you look at it, and it would mark the beginning of a life spent behind steel doors and fluorescent lights, carrying a vendetta that never went away, as he'd be sentenced to life in prison with no parole. In prison, Jasper Rushing developed a reputation, a fearsome one. He wasn't the kind of inmate who preyed on the weak. Instead, he hunted the predators. Over the years, Rushing attacked, stabbed, and severely injured multiple sex offenders and domestic violence abusers, often with homemade weapons. He called them the lowest kind of filth, and he saw himself as one willing to do what the system won't. Correctional officers knew his pattern. His violence wasn't random. He went after inmates who bragged about hurting women, who talked about children, or who disrespected female staff, including gunning, when they take out their thing and just yank it. Though, through all his violence, he was very intelligent, Machiavellian, articulate, calculating, but at the same time, intelligence made him dangerous, because once he believed someone deserved punishment, nothing could stop him. And no one is more dangerous than a man that believes he's right beyond a reasonable doubt. Rushing, a veteran in prison by now, who's been locked up for over 10 years, was trying to move himself out of danger. He had been accused of extorting another inmate, but he later said it was a setup, a way to get himself transferred into protective custody so he could live alone. "All I basically need is light, running water, and a book, and I'm okay." In an ironic twist of fate, he would tell reporters, "I guess this wasn't within reason." Instead of the single cell he expected, the Arizona Department of Corrections placed him in a cell, A26, a small isolation cell within the protective segregation unit of the Buckley building at Lewis Prison. The cell was built for one man, but they decided to put two inside. To make matters worse, even though it was supposed to only hold one inmate, and they had two, the light was broken. For weeks, no one fixed it. Only a thin beam from the door slot cut through the blackness. Rushing will be quoted calling it pitch black insanity. He could not read or even see his own hands. He would go on to say the air stank of metal and sweat. Both men slipped into their own madness. His cellmate, Shannon Palmer, 40 years old, was serving the tail end of a 3-year sentence for criminal damage after climbing a Salt River Project power pole during a thunderstorm. Rushing would go on to say, "It was not a healthy environment in there. It was pitch black. I couldn't read or think straight. That's what can happen in a place like that." Day after day, trapped in total darkness, Rushing listened to Palmer's endless paranoid rants. Palmer talked about child abductions, government control, and hidden devices in his body. Rushing, a man who despised anyone mentioning children in twisted contexts, it was pure torture. However, from the moment Palmer entered the cell, inmates on the tier whispered that Palmer was faking it. Many believed he exaggerated his mental illness to get protective housing and special treatment. Men in high security units, that kind of behavior made him stand out and put a target on his back. To make things worse, Palmer begged officers to move him out, shouting through the food slot that he didn't feel safe and he couldn't stay in the cell. Officers laughed it off, thinking it was just another outburst from a man they believed was pretending to be mentally ill. Lights in the cell, still broken. After what happened next, Rushing made his mind up. and said this man could not live anymore. He stated to the news, "I started seeing him as worse than one of them, a man who disrespected and sexualized children." Then came the moment that Rushing said changed everything. Palmer allegedly made a sexual comment about Rushing's niece while Rushing was reading his Bible. He pointed at the picture inside of the Bible, a photo of Rushing's niece tucked between the pages, and said something filthy. Rushing said he didn't get emotional, didn't scream, didn't yell, just knew that now he signed his death warrant. And as the days went on, he would gather what he needed to murder him. Last morning, that one man would leave the cell alive and get put on death row, and another man will get handed his death sentence just weeks before he was supposed to go home. Palmer's recorded call, he voiced fears. He talked about the CIA, the microchips, and people trying to kill him, and told his mom he loved her. The opposite end of the spectrum, Rushing told his mother he was formulating his own plan, which he later said referred to suicide, not homicide. The next morning, September 10th, 2010, they ate breakfast in the dark and settled in for another day. Around 12:58 to 1 p.m., an adjacent inmate, Joel Hughes, heard a choking and gurgling from A26, followed by about 20 to 25 loud bangs. Hughes would yell, "Is everything all right over there?" He says a voice that sounded like Rushing answered, "Just a minute." Now what was going on is horrendous. This is very graphic. This is the order of acts that the courts and investigators concluded. Initial bludgeoning. Rushing fashioned a striking tool by wrapping several hardback books tightly in a small sheet, effectively a small club, repeatedly struck Palmer's head. What it is you get magazines and books and roll them as tight as possible, get them wet. It's almost like cement. Those 20 to 25 bangs was that prison baseball bat going across Palmer's head. With no defensive wounds, it sounds like Palmer got knocked out instantly and he bashed his skull in while he was unconscious. If that wasn't enough, he would switch to a blade. Rushing then used a homemade shank, the cutting edge made from a razor blade, and inflicted multiple slashing wounds around Palmer's neck. Officers later described hearing the sucking, wheezing of air drawn through deep throat cuts. When they arrived, classic signs of extensive lacerations to the airway. Still infuriated about what he said about women and children and his own little niece, he would mutilate his genitals after he was already dead. The Arizona Supreme Court summarized the evidence that the severing of the genitals occurred after the fatal neck wound, describing it as unnecessary violence. Blood patterns were concentrated on and beside the bed, showing that Palmer was unconscious or on his way to death when the mutilation happened. Announcement seconds later, Officer Joe Valvadinos opened the tray slot to pass lunch. Rushing popped his head out and said, "I just killed my cellie." Officer put his flashlight in, and at first he said, "I don't see anything." Rushing said, "Because it's pitch black, you can't see in there." Then he saw the scene. Palmer on the bed, unconscious, bleeding profusely from the neck, one arm hanging, where the severed part of his body lay on the floor. First, that detail was missed in the report because of the darkness and the blood. Inmate Rushing complied with the orders and cuffed up through the food slot. Rushing said, "I'm calm as day," one officer said. Sergeant and the captain took command. The staff began CPR, but they warned squeamish responders not to enter. Despite efforts, Palmer died minutes later. Seeking a motive, Rushing would say to the officer, he said bluntly, "You mess with women and children, then you're gonna mess with the real man." Elsewhere, he said Palmer's crude comments about kids and about Rushing's niece were the last straw. However, the only account they have is Rushing's. Veteran Lewis Lieutenant quit days later, publicly blasting staffing shortages and the week-long dead light. In A26, calling darkness dangerous for everyone, he said the two should have never been double bunked there. Palmer's mother, Frances Henderson, sued the state for wrongful death, showing how her son had begged for a transfer out of that cell and the officers ignored. Negligent light that was broken for weeks, she would receive $350,000. Rushing would be sentenced to death row. Stay out, stay free.